Hello, hello, hello. Please like and subscribe. I'm really delighted to be joined by Mandu Reid of the Women's Equality Party, the leader of the Women's Equality Party. Now, many of you, unless you've been living under a rock, will be aware of a big scandal that enveloped the royal family. The Queen Consort, Camilla Parker Bowles, held a reception at Buckingham Palace, focusing on working to end violence against women and girls. Very, very important indeed, of course. And Mandu Reid was there alongside Ngozi Fulani. Now, Mandu, a lot of people have heard about this. Firstly, just tell us a bit about Ngozi, like what she does, and then I'll ask what happened.
Yeah, sure. Ngozi's an amazing woman. She is a long-standing activist, campaigner, but also runs this charity, this organization called Sistah Space, which focuses on domestic abuse victims of sexual violence from an African heritage background. So it's specialist. It's really needed because a lot of the generic services out there aren't as equipped as they should be to deal with the particular, experiences and considerations that group require. And yeah, she's just a powerhouse of a woman who works so hard day in, day out to, make a real difference for women and girls across London.
Now, at this event, so Lady Susan Hussey,
Yeah.
who was the lady in waiting to Queen Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Now, she approached you both. Tell us exactly what happened.
It was extraordinary, Owen. Myself, Ngozi, and another woman had arrived in the main reception room where this gathering was taking place. And within 10 minutes, Lady Susan approached us and said hello, zoomed in on Ngozi and asked her where she was from. Ngozi said Sistah Space because that's the organization she leads and is representing at the event. But what followed was something that can only really be described as an inquisition or an interrogation. Lady Hussey persisted. She said, no, what I mean is, where do you come from? Ngozi said, Hackney. That wasn't a good enough answer. Where do you really come from? Ngozi said, East London. She was a little bit kind of baffled as to the persistence. That wasn't a good enough answer. She inquired about her nationality, and it was question after question after question. A refusal to accept Ngozi's answers, particularly when Ngozi said, I am British. I was born here. I've never lived anywhere else. No. At that point, Lady Hussey said, I can see it's going to be a real challenge getting clear from you where you actually come from. And it was prolonged. It went on for minutes. It wasn't a couple of seconds. It went on for minutes. And by the end of it, we were literally dumbfounded. Gobsmacked. And me and Ngozi aren't like that. We're upbeat people, we're talkative people, but we were stunned to silence, and it tainted the whole thing. The atmosphere shifted for us. Ngozi wanted to go home at that point. And Lady Susan seemed to be entirely oblivious, felt entitled to the information she was demanding. And yeah, the vibe was really, really bad.
Yeah, and it's so important that you just explained in detail, because I think a lot of people have tried to gaslight you after this event into, just asking where people are from. This is unquestionably racist behavior. And anyone who doesn't see that, I think, has a problem.
100%.
I want to ask about the broader kind of context of all this, but let's just be blunt about this. Lady Susan Hussey has worked at the heart of the monarchy for a very long time.
That's right.
Like decades. When we've heard in terms of the treatment of Meghan Markle and accusations that have been made, including a senior royal, for example, in interrogating them about the colour of the skin of their prospective unborn child.
Yeah.
What I suppose I would ask is, I doubt Lady Hussey, this is just some one-off, like some massive deviation from her personality. And when people speak like that, it's generally because they haven't been checked. Like they haven't in the past Because what will happen when we learn and grow, it's often because people around us go, oh, you shouldn't say that. And this is why it's wrong to say that.
Yeah.
Well, that hasn't happened with her.
No. And I think it's really important to be clear about Lady Susan Hussey. Sure, she's an 82-year-old woman, but she's worked within the royal household for 60 years. And I think that means she's probably a pretty good barometer of the culture within that institution, of the norms within that institution. And for her, she saw absolutely nothing wrong with speaking to us in the way that she did. You can be damn sure that if we were white women, there's no chance of us being on the receiving end of a probing kind of inquisition like that. And I think a lot of people have said, no, but she's from a different era and you got to give her some latitude because of that. You know, the life she's led, she's probably traveled to more countries than I have, than you have, than both of us combined. She's been at the Queen's side for several decades. So she has been exposed to changing times, as well as many different cultures and environments. And I actually think it's a bit demeaning and smacks of ageism when people say an 82-year-old can't be responsible for their conduct, especially an 82-year-old who is as steeped in this very privileged institution as she is. So yeah, there has been a bit of pushback on that, but I think it's completely baseless.
In terms of just the monarchy as an institution, I think maybe wouldn't some just go, well, look, the monarchy look at its history, look at its relationship with colonialism. Is the issue just on a systemic level? So my camera's shaking there because my cats are marauding around me.
I think that's lovely.
Hopefully they won't throw the camera over, which they have done on live television once. So in terms of, do you not think partly, isn't this just kind of revealing that the monarchy is just some would say an inherently racist institution? I mean, people regard that as an inflammatory thing to say.
I think it definitely paints that picture. You have what we experienced on Tuesday. You stitch that together with what you've already touched on, the reports from Prince Harry and Meghan about their experiences that brought her to the brink of suicide. And the casualness of the encounter for me is something, the encounter we had that I witnessed between Ngozi and Lady Hussey. The casualness of it, I think, is a sign that you are talking about an institution in which these dynamics are normalized, in which the kind of status hierarchy between people of color, the white aristocratic, true born, whatever you want to call them, really, really persists. We shouldn't be surprised by it. You're talking about an institution that owes a lot of its success to a heritage of slavery, empire, colonialism. Inequality is baked into the fabric of that institution. But the way the palace responded, I think, is really intriguing. They did respond super quickly, right? And I think they perhaps did that because a few things are happening. There's William and Kate who are in the States, so there's profile there. There's the Netflix thing coming out next week, and so they're probably feeling a little bit more sensitive. They obviously pushed Lady Hussey to resign, but my issue with that is it minimizes what actually has taken place. It's like we've seen in the Metropolitan Police, for example. We do a lot of campaigning in that space where what they try and do is create a bad apple narrative, create narratives that say this is an isolated incident, but don't worry, this person has been moved out of the way, nothing to see here, job done. And I think we see that, there's the Metropolitan Police, there's the fire brigade, there's Parliament itself, there's the two major political parties have also issues related to institutional misogyny, institutional racism that they've been very, very, very reluctant to tackle. And this, for me, is just entirely consistent with that pattern we see in so many different areas of our society at the moment.
I mean, that was, what I wanted. The other thing I wanted to ask you about in terms of the wider context, like the experience, the lived experience of people of colour in Britain.
Yeah.
And, this is an example, obviously, of, someone in the royal court.
Sure.
But just tell me, what do you think this, because obviously we can talk about when we have about the monarchy and the nature of it as an institution. But in terms of British society, there'll be some who, who get very angry. The idea of Britain is a racist society. How dare you? And, they get more angry about accusations of racism than racism. But what do you think this, what's the wider point about race in modern Britain and racism, where in terms of where things are at in 2022?
I feel like when you do zoom out, right, and if you look at our national discourse and the way it's kind of evolved over the last few years, it feels like we're regressing. I actually think, there was the Sewell report last year, which said institutional racism doesn't exist. It's a figment of all of our imaginations. This week, on actually, the day this story broke, the Buckingham Palace story that we're talking about broke, you had Nigel Farage popping up, decrying the latest census data, which he claimed told the country the terrible, tragic story that London, Manchester, and Birmingham are now minority white cities. First of all, that was incorrect. But what's so interesting about that was the data point he used was white British. So when he was tallying up the scenario in London, he wasn't counting me in that. I'm British, but he wouldn't have counted me in his, doom and gloom forecasts, I guess, dog whistling to his far right cronies. And so you see, Ngozi's Britishness was challenged by a member of the royal court. And then you've got a politician who gets disproportionate airtime popping up in the same week with the story he wants to tell about how white British people in our major cities are an endangered species. The rest of us, brown, black British people, we don't count. And so I think, and that's just so normal now. You're seeing that more and more. It dismays me how the main sort of political wrangling we're seeing in this country around immigration has lurched massively to the right in all of the mainstream political parties. And I think when you stitch all those things together, it does matter that this encounter happened. It does matter that Ngozi effectively decided to whistleblow it. And I think what we have to use this moment as an opportunity to have these really, really difficult conversations about our institutions, how racism manifests. Misogyny is also alongside racism. They travel together in so many of these institutions. And I think we got to be brave. Those of us who are squeezed, struggling on the left side of the political spectrum, I think we've got to use these opportunities to force that conversation to happen.
I mean, finally, you've kind of partly answered that, but, what would you like the kind of, the legacy of this really, distressing incident, if we're going to be honest about it? What would you like? Because obviously it's caused a huge storm, huge amounts of media conversation, discussion, not all of it very constructive and helpful. I found one of the worst ones in The Spectator suggesting that how could Lady Hussey possibly be racist because she went out with someone with one leg? I'm not joking. I mean, people might think I'm exaggerating there, but that was...
You're not exaggerating. That was Petronella Wyatt, Boris's ex.
Fascinating contribution to the discussion, I found. What would you like kind of, this is kind of, because you often look through history, there are these big moments which then, kind of trigger conversations, and they're seen as quite influential in helping to shift discourse. So what would you like this to achieve?
There's a few things. I hope this emboldens other whistleblowers in all sorts of scenarios, settings, institutions. It felt pretty exposing, I'm not going to lie, to stand up and effectively, whistleblow on the firm. And Ngozi in particular has been on the receiving end of quite a lot of backlash for that. However, what has also happened is the palace, the monarchy are on the back foot and have to engage. have to acknowledge. They reached out to Ngozi today, finally, and I don't know what that's going to mean in practice. But I think there's that. So whistleblowers, please find the courage, find the support you need, do it. Because at the moment, a discourse is taking hold that tries to minimize, deny, and deflect that these problems really exist. And I think I want back on the table this idea that racism, misogyny, homophobia manifests in institutional ways. And those in leadership of those institutions have a responsibility and a duty. And I hope an incident like this makes them feel a pressure to actually do something about it, rather than, people have said about Lady Susan Hussey, oh, don't you feel bad? You've ruined this woman's life. I'm like, no. We didn't say she should resign. We didn't do that. The palace are the ones who have effectively thrown her under the bus. They could have taken responsibility for this, for what happened, in a much more holistic way. And I want that to become the template. I want the template for how we deal with these things to include believing people who come forward, accepting that these things are very rarely, if ever, isolated incidents, and are usually symptomatic of a pattern, a culture, a set of norms that's deeply damaging to people of color, women, other marginalized groups. And I think if this episode achieves that, I'll look back and I will. I mean, I don't regret that we stood up and called it out, but I'd love to see some of those things flow from the fact that this has happened.
And nor should you regret it. I have to say, I think it does take huge amounts of courage, not least, as we know in political life, when women, particularly women of colour, speak out, particularly on issues to do with race, you get some of the worst, most vicious elements in British society climb out of the woodwork and go. So, it takes a huge amount of courage, and it is the monarchy we're talking about. It was hugely courageous, I think, on both your parts. And hopefully it leads to more conversations like this. So yeah, I think I'm sure all of us watching or listening to this have nothing but admiration and respect for the stand that you took. So thank you. Thank you so much to Mandu Reid, who is, of course, the leader of the Women's Equality Party. Do follow her on Twitter at Mandu Reid, I suppose. Is that, MANDUREID. So do follow her. And also for those Women's Equality Party, also can follow them. Please like and subscribe. And thank you so much to Mandu.